From the outside, Richard Lee McNair looked like any other ordinary young man raised in the quiet towns of North Dakota. Born into a military family in 1958, he grew up with discipline, structure, and clear expectations. In his early years, he showed intelligence and athleticism, and those who knew him described him as charismatic, clever, and driven. But beneath that clean-cut exterior simmered a restlessness that would one day turn deadly. By the mid-1980s, McNair was a staff sergeant in the U.S. Air Force, stationed at Minot Air Force Base. He was respected by his peers, a man who followed orders, and someone who could be relied upon. But like many who live dual lives, his darker impulses were hidden in plain sight. He had developed a habit of theft, breaking into homes and buildings in search of cash and valuables. For McNair, it wasn't just about need, it was about the thrill, the control, and the sense of power that came with it. Then came the morning of November 17th, 1987, a day that would shatter the illusion of his normalcy forever. McNair broke into a grain elevator in Minot, North Dakota, with the intent to rob it. But things didn't go as planned. Inside, he encountered two men, one of whom was 24-year-old truck driver Jerry Theus. McNair, armed and desperate, panicked. A struggle broke out. In the chaos, McNair shot both men. One survived. Theus did not. Within hours, investigators began piecing together the evidence. A stolen car, blood-stained clothing, a weapon, all roads led to McNair. What baffled many was that someone with a military background, someone who appeared so composed and intelligent, could commit such a senseless act. But for McNair, the mask had finally slipped. He was arrested later that day. During interrogation, he remained surprisingly calm. He spun stories, shifted timelines, and tried to outwit detectives. But the truth had already caught up with him. The evidence was overwhelming, and he would soon face charges of murder, attempted murder, and burglary. In 1988, Richard Lee McNair was convicted and sentenced to 2 life terms plus 30 years. The courtroom was tense. The family of Jerry Theus sat in silence as the sentence was handed down. For them, justice was served, but the pain remained. McNair's first days in prison were marked by silence. Unlike most inmates who entered with rage or remorse, he was reflective, watchful. He read, exercised, and plotted. He was not the kind to accept confinement. Prison to him was not an end. It was merely a puzzle waiting to be solved. He was transferred to the North Dakota State Penitentiary, a facility not unfamiliar with hardened criminals. But even there, McNair stood out. He kept to himself, rarely causing trouble. But he was always thinking, always observing. Guards underestimated him. Inmates saw him as peculiar. Yet behind his quiet demeanor, he was already engineering the next phase of his life. This was not just the story of a man who had committed murder. It was the story of a man who would, over time, become one of America's most cunning prison escape artists. But before the escapes, before the international manhunts and solitary confinement, there was a single defining moment, a bullet fired in panic, a young man's life taken, and another man's soul forever fractured. Richard Lee, the man behind bars and fear, doesn't begin with an escape. It begins with a choice, a moment of violence that spiraled into decades of chaos. And in that choice lies the terrifying question: what happens when a brilliant mind turns criminal? What if the man behind bars is more dangerous not because of his strength, but because of his mind? The prison gates had closed, but for Richard McNair, the story was just beginning. Prison was never going to hold Richard Lee McNair, not for long. From the moment the bars slammed shut, he began dissecting his environment, testing routines, probing weaknesses. He wasn't just a prisoner, he was a strategist. And soon, the world would come to know the name McNair, not only for murder, but for escape. Escape number 1, the paperclip trick, 1988. Just months into his life sentence, McNair executed his first escape. He was being held at the Ward County Jail in North Dakota, a facility more accustomed to holding petty criminals than seasoned escape artists. One afternoon, While being interviewed by detectives, McNair managed to slip out of his handcuffs, using nothing but lip balm and a paperclip. He slid out of the room while officers were distracted. Without fanfare or violence, he simply walked away. The escape was short-lived. Police caught him within hours hiding under a table in a nearby building, but it was a signal. McNair wasn't going to wait decades behind bars. He was already experimenting. Escape number 2, Breaking Through Steel, 1992. 4 years later, housed in the North Dakota State Penitentiary, McNair tried again, this time with help. He and 2 other inmates cut through a ventilation duct in the prison's gymnasium. It was a plan that had taken months, involving makeshift tools, late-night workouts as cover, and careful timing. They wriggled through the duct and made it outside the prison fence. This time, McNair stayed out for 9 months. He traveled across multiple states, using fake IDs and stealing to survive. His intelligence and calm demeanor helped him blend in. He wasn't just running, he was studying law enforcement, understanding how manhunts operated, and perfecting the art of becoming invisible. When he was finally recaptured, he was calm, almost amused. He saw each escape not as a failure, but as training for something greater. Escape number 3, The Mailbag Masterpiece, 2006. It would take over a decade, but McNair's third escape cemented his legend. By 2006, he was incarcerated at USP Pollock, a high-security federal prison in Louisiana. The facility was fortress-like, crawling with guards, cameras, and razor wire. But McNair had been watching, planning, and waiting. Assigned to work in a prison warehouse repairing mailbags, McNair spotted an opportunity. Every day, industrial mailbags filled with outgoing mail were shrink-wrapped onto pallets and transported outside the prison fence. Over months, he crafted a secret compartment inside one of those pallets, a space just big enough for him to hide in, with air holes and a breathing tube disguised among the bags. On April 5th, 2006, McNair climbed into the pallet, sealed himself in, and waited. The pallet was shrink-wrapped, loaded onto a truck, and driven beyond the prison walls. Hours later, he cut himself free with a small blade he'd smuggled in. Just like that, he was gone. The escape was so clean that prison officials didn't realize he was missing for hours. When they reviewed surveillance footage, they were stunned. No climbing fences, no alarms, no chaos. He had quite literally mailed himself out of a federal prison. The manhunt that followed spanned Canada and the United States. McNair would be stopped by police more than once, most notably by a Canadian Mountie who interviewed him and let him go, fooled by McNair's charm and fake identity. The FBI dubbed him brilliant. He was a ghost, a myth, until his final capture in 2007. But even then, he wore a grin. McNair's escapes weren't just acts of desperation, they were feats of psychological warfare. Each one revealed more than his cunning. They revealed the terrifying truth that the most dangerous men behind bars aren't always the strongest. They're the smartest. By 2007, Richard Lee McNair had become a legend, a phantom that haunted law enforcement across 2 countries. His escapes were surgical, his false identities airtight, and his charm disarming. After slipping out of a federal prison in a mailbag the previous year, he had traveled thousands of miles, reinvented himself multiple times, and even talked his way out of detainment by a Canadian officer. But even ghosts leave footprints. It was a brisk October day in New Brunswick, Canada, when McNair's luck finally ran out. He was jogging near a railway yard in the small town of Campbellton when local police approached him. He looked healthy, tanned, relaxed, certainly not like a man who had spent the last 18 months on the run. He gave a fake name, of course, claimed he was a tourist. But this time his story didn't hold. One officer noticed that his accent didn't match his claimed origins. Another recalled a bulletin with McNair's face on it. Backup arrived, fingerprints were taken, and just like that, the world's most wanted fugitive was finally unmasked. After more than a year of cat and mouse, Richard Lee McNair was in handcuffs once again. His arrest made international headlines. It wasn't just that he had escaped. It was how he had done it, and how long he had stayed free. Reporters called him the Houdini of prisons. The FBI called him one of the most clever escapees they had ever encountered. But behind the headlines, another story was unfolding, one of reckoning. McNair was extradited back to the United States, where the justice system wasted no time. This time, there would be no margin for error. He was designated to ADX Florence in Colorado, the most secure prison in the country, also known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. It's a place built for silence, isolation, and absolute control. For a man who had spent years outwitting security systems, ADX would be the endgame. There, inside a 7 by 12-foot concrete cell, McNair began his new life. 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, 1 hour outside in a small enclosed concrete yard known as the cage. No human contact, no conversation, just him, 4 walls, and his thoughts. To the outside world, McNair had vanished again, but this time into the deep void of America's harshest prison. But inside, something unexpected happened. He began to write. At first, it was just letters to a journalist who had followed his story. Then it became deeper, pages and pages of typed reflections. He wrote about his escapes in detail, not to boast, but to analyze. He examined the moments of violence, the mistakes, the lies he told others and himself. In those writings, a new version of McNair emerged, not the escape artist, but the observer, a man dissecting his own mind. He admitted to manipulation, to pride, to regret. He wrote of Jerry Theus, the young man he had killed in 1987, and how that moment had haunted him more than any prison ever could. "I ran from that day more than I ever ran from the police," he once wrote. "I buried him in my mind, but I never escaped what I did." McNair's letters offer a rare glimpse into the psychology of a fugitive, not just the mechanics of escape, but the soul of a man who couldn't face the weight of his actions. He spoke of the addiction to freedom, the high of outsmarting authority, and the slow, creeping emptiness that followed each escape. At ADX, there was no audience, no chase, just the truth. In time, McNair became a cautionary tale taught in law enforcement academies and correctional conferences. His story is studied not just for what he did, but for how close he came to pulling off the impossible, for how intelligence without conscience can become a weapon more dangerous than a gun. Richard Lee, the man behind bars and fear, doesn't end with sirens or gunfire. It ends in silence, a man alone with the truth of his past and the walls that won't let him run anymore. Because in the end, the greatest prison wasn't built from steel or concrete. It was the one Richard McNair carried inside himself all along.